Real talk, real is talk. Real talk is talk, real cheap. And the rest is just squawk, squawk, cheap, cheap. Two friends talking about everything they're trying to comprehend. My friend, with all these light bulbs popping in our minds, we share our ideas with one another. Time to talk, cheap friends tripping because we're all hella booked up in these lives. Saturday's the night we get to riff and laugh, cause that's alright. Talk, talk, talk is cheap. Real talk, talk, talk is so cheap, cheap. It's so motherfunkin' cheap, 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 cheap. Can't be any cheaper unless it costs us something so cheap other than time spent. Cause that's what we're willing to spare. Because cheap, cheap is what it's gotta be. So cheap, 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 cheap. And that is all we've got to share. We got 2 tickets to board these planes of your reality. They know we just missed our train to Trans Central. Hey you, all aboard, it's Saturday night. Cheap train, so cheap, cheap. And real talk is cheaper than ever, ever. Real talk is cheap.